So, do you think that ultimately that would pretty much be largely the same DNA to produce someone who looked Mexican?
Scroll through search trends, and you'll see it immediately. The question people keep asking, like it has a clean answer. What ethnicity is closest to Mexicans? But genetic research tells a very different story, especially the 2014 landmark study covered by the LA Times and published in Science, which found Mexican populations vary so widely that indigenous groups inside Mexico can be as genetically distant from each other as Europeans are from East Asians. But when scientists ran the DNA comparisons, why did the results raise the question itself? The question that breaks science. Somewhere inside a lab report that most people never read properly, a question kept breaking the data every time scientists tried to answer it. What ethnicity is closest to Mexicans? It sounds simple until the genomes start arguing back, and that is exactly what pulled researchers into the 2014 Science Journal study covered by the LA Times, where Stanford-led teams realized they were not dealing with one population at all. They were staring at a genetic landscape so uneven that it refused to compress into a single identity, no matter how the models were adjusted. Some regions in Mexico showed ancestry patterns leaning heavily European, while others carried deeply rooted indigenous signals that remained intact despite centuries of mixing. And get this, according to Stanford Medicine's official release on the study, this variation wasn't noise because it followed geography almost perfectly. Think about that for a second, because what the researchers found next completely reframed how we think about Mexican identity. The 2014 analysis, described in the Science article and summarized by LA Times reporting, was the first fine-scale mapping of genetic variation across Mexico's entire geographic spread. It revealed something unexpected, which was that indigenous populations inside Mexico were not genetically uniform, but instead split into deep regional clusters shaped by mountains, distance, and isolation. And here's where it gets interesting, because those differences inside indigenous groups were so large that LA Times coverage noted they can mirror the gap between Europeans and East Asians. So when European ancestry entered the picture through colonization, it didn't erase the older structure, since it simply layered itself unevenly across regions. According to Wikipedia's synthesis of Mexican ancestry data, northern and western regions today show between roughly 66.7% and 95% European ancestry, while central and southeastern areas show far higher indigenous proportions. Mestizo populations sit right in the middle, averaging about 52% European, 44% Native American, and a small African contribution, which is usually around 2 to 4%. But what makes this even more striking is what Stanford researchers highlighted, which was that the indigenous genetic component itself still follows the same geographic structure even after centuries of mixing. In other words, conquest didn't erase the map, it blurred it. At some point, you start wondering how a single label like Mexican ever became the default answer for something this layered. And maybe the real question isn't who Mexicans are closest to, but why we keep forcing a single genetic box onto something that clearly behaves more like a gradient across land and history. Because once you zoom into the data, especially the mapping work described by Stanford Medicine, you realize geography isn't just background detail here, as it's the main driver of genetic difference across the entire country. And that gradient doesn't care about modern borders or national identity, since it moves quietly through mountains, coastlines, and centuries of movement. This is why researchers keep emphasizing, according to the Science Journal analysis, that Mexico's genetic structure behaves less like a single population and more like a layered map of human history written into DNA itself. And once that picture becomes clear, the idea of asking for a single closest ethnicity starts to fall apart completely, because biology was never built to answer it in the first place at all today. If geography explains the European indigenous split across regions, what does your DNA reveal about how this mixing actually happened and whose bodies paid the price? The 90-10 lie, hidden in your DNA. There's a pattern that shows up in Mexican genetics so consistently that it almost feels uncomfortable to look at, not because it's hidden, but because once you see it, it refuses to go away. Maternal lines tell one story, while paternal lines tell another, and when scientists lined them up side by side, something very uneven started to emerge. According to a broad synthesis of Mexican genetic studies summarized on Wikipedia and supported by multiple peer-reviewed datasets, around 90% of Mexicans carry Native American maternal haplogroups. That means if you trace the direct mother-to-child line back far enough, the overwhelming majority lead into indigenous roots, but then you flip the direction to the paternal line and the picture changes sharply. European Y chromosome ancestry rises to about 64.9%, while Native American paternal lineages drop closer to 30.8%. And that gap doesn't behave like normal mixing because it behaves like history with direction. Harvard's analysis of native Mexican mtDNA lineages, hosted in its DASH repository, found similar stability in maternal ancestry, reporting roughly 89.1% Native American, with small European and African contributions sitting far behind at 5.4 and 4.5%. So across independent datasets and across different sampling groups, the same asymmetry keeps appearing. Maternal lines stay indigenous, while paternal lines shift heavily European. And now, here's where it gets harder to ignore what that actually implies. Because if ancestry was evenly mixed through mutual population blending, you'd expect both sides of the genetic line to reflect that balance. But instead, what shows up in the genome is directional, almost one-sided inheritance at scale. The PMC study on genome-wide ancestry in Mexican-American populations describes how migrations brought together people from at least 3 continents, forming entirely new populations across the Americas. But even in that broader admixture, the structure isn't symmetrical since it carries a signature of imbalance that doesn't flatten out over time. Think about that for a second, because this isn't just percentages in a chart, as this is inheritance pointing back through centuries of unequal power. Because mitochondrial DNA passes only through mothers and Y chromosomes only through fathers, they preserve 2 separate historical records inside the same population. And when those records don't match, you don't get ambiguity, since you get a time-stamped contradiction. Across multiple genetic studies, including Harvard's population work, indigenous women's lineages remained remarkably intact, suggesting they stayed rooted in communities even as colonial systems expanded. Meanwhile, European male lineages expanded rapidly, becoming dominant in paternal traces across large portions of the population. The simplest interpretation researchers keep returning to is also the hardest one to sit with, which is that this wasn't a random blending of populations on equal terms, because it was structured, repeated, and tied to the conditions of conquest. And here's the part that quietly reframes everything we usually associate with mestizo identity. The genetic record doesn't show a clean fusion of 2 equal ancestries, since it shows a persistent imbalance where one side of the family tree carries continuity, and the other carries expansion through dominance. Somewhere in that imbalance, you start to realize the DNA isn't just telling a biological story, because it's echoing a social one that history books often compress into simpler language. So when researchers map Mexican ancestry today, they're not just looking at where genes came from. They're seeing how power moved through populations, how communities absorbed disruption, and how some lineages survived intact while others spread through entirely different mechanisms. And once that pattern becomes visible, it changes how you read every percentage on the page, because behind every ratio is a lived reality that shaped it. But if the maternal-paternal asymmetry reveals colonial violence, how extreme does the geographic genetic split get when you compare a Mexican from the far north to one from the far south? North versus south, the genetic wallet split. If you zoom out far enough, Mexico looks like a single genetic story. But the moment scientists stopped treating it as one block and started mapping region by region, the picture split cleanly down the middle and then kept splitting again. According to the 2014 Stanford-led study covered by the LA Times, genetic variation in Mexico doesn't distribute randomly, since it follows geography almost like it's drawn along invisible lines that run parallel to the country's mountain ranges. And those lines matter because they separate populations in ways that national identity never really prepared for. Start in the Northwest, in places like Sonora. Here, according to ancestry breakdowns summarized on Wikipedia and supported by broader population studies, European ancestry can reach anywhere from roughly 66.7% up to even 95% in some groups. In genetic terms, individuals from these regions often cluster closer to Spanish and broader Western European populations, especially those tied historically to Andalusia and other Iberian regions. And then you move south. It is not even a huge distance on a map, but genetically, it feels like a different layer of history opening up. By the time you reach southern states like Chiapas, the genetic signal shifts dramatically as indigenous ancestry becomes dominant again, with many populations showing close affinity to Maya-related or broader Mesoamerican indigenous groups. According to the same LA Times, reporting on the Stanford research, this isn't a minor variation because it's a structured gradient that mirrors both colonial settlement intensity and pre-existing indigenous population density. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the middle doesn't smooth things out. Mexico City, which is one of the largest urban centers in the world, carries a mixed profile that sits right in between these extremes. Studies summarized in Wikipedia and reflected in genetic ancestry datasets describe the average mestizo profile in central Mexico as roughly 52% European, 44% Native American, and a small African component of around 2 to 4%. But what stands out isn't just the mix, as it's the fact that this mix doesn't point closer to any single external population, since it sits in its own cluster entirely. Think about that for a second, because even in a highly urbanized genetic melting pot, there's no single closest ethnicity that cleanly captures it. And this is where multiple independent sources start reinforcing the same idea. The National Geographic Genographic Project describes Mexican ancestry as a north-to-south gradient, shaped by both pre-Columbian population structure and uneven Spanish settlement patterns. Ancestry DNA's educational breakdown of Mexican heritage echoes this, emphasizing that regional origin inside Mexico often matters more than national identity when predicting genetic similarity. Even 23andMe's heritage insights point to the same conclusion, showing Mexican ancestry profiles shifting significantly depending on whether a person's family traces back to northern border states or southern indigenous regions. So what you end up with isn't a uniform population, because it's a slope that forms a continuous transition from one genetic reality into another. Northern Mexico, shaped by heavier Spanish colonization and historical indigenous population decline, leans more toward European ancestry signals, while southern Mexico retains stronger indigenous continuity. And the center becomes this layered overlap, where neither side fully dominates. Here's the uncomfortable part. Researchers don't always emphasize out loud. A person from Sonora in the north and a person from Chiapas in the south can be more genetically distant from each other than either is from populations outside Mexico entirely. This is not because they aren't both Mexican, but because Mexican in genetic terms is not a single cluster at all. It's a gradient stretched across geography, history, and centuries of uneven contact. And once you see that gradient clearly, the label starts to feel less like a genetic category and more like a national umbrella, holding multiple distinct population histories underneath it. So the real question shifts again. If North and South Mexico are this different, how extreme does it get among indigenous groups that never mixed with Europeans at all? The Seri and the Maya. Somewhere in the genetic data from Mexico, there's a comparison that stops feeling like it belongs inside a single country. A Seri individual from the Gulf of California in the northwest, and a Lacandan Maya individual from deep near the Guatemala border in the southeast. When scientists lined up their DNA, what they saw wasn't subtle variation because it was distance, which was real, continental-scale distance hiding inside one nation. According to the 2014 Stanford-led study covered by the LA Times, the genetic gap between some indigenous groups in Mexico is as large as the gap between Europeans and East Asians. This is not slightly different, nor is it regional variation, since it is the same magnitude of separation you'd expect between populations from entirely different continents. And that's where things start to get a little surreal. The Science Journal coverage of the same research describes it in even sharper terms, noting that Mexico contains indigenous populations that are as genetically distinct from each other as Europeans are from Chinese populations. Think about that for a second, because it flips the usual assumption completely. Most people imagine indigenous groups in the Americas as broadly similar, but the genome tells a different story, which is one shaped by isolation that goes back thousands of years. Here's the thing. Geography in Mexico didn't just separate people slightly, as it locked them into different evolutionary paths. According to Stanford Medicine's official release on the 2014 study, mountain ranges and long distances created natural barriers that preserved distinct genetic lineages long before European contact ever happened. So when researchers say diversity, they're not talking about recent mixing, because they're talking about deep pre-Columbian structure still visible today. And get this, since the Gulf News report on the same data set highlights something even more striking for medical science. These differences aren't just academic, as they're large enough that treating indigenous Mexican populations as genetically uniform could distort how diseases are understood and treated. Because genetically, they aren't uniform at all, since they are multiple distinct population histories layered within one geographic border. Now here's where it gets even more unexpected. The Science article on the study emphasizes that Mexico may contain more genetic diversity within its borders than entire continents. That means two indigenous groups living in the same modern country can be as different from each other as populations separated by oceans and land masses elsewhere on Earth. And that level of variation didn't appear recently because it predates European arrival by thousands of years, as confirmed in the broader context from National Geographic Geographic research on Indigenous American ancestry. So when the Spanish arrived, they didn't encounter one unified indigenous population, since they encountered dozens of deeply separated ones, which were each already shaped by geography, isolation, and time. European admixture layered onto that structure later, but it didn't erase it. It just sat on top like a thin, uneven filter, which is why the indigenous genetic signal still mirrors those ancient divisions even in modern mestizo populations. And this is where the assumption most people carry quietly collapses, because if a Seri and a Maya can be as genetically distant as Europeans are from East Asians, then indigenous Mexican stops being a single category altogether. It becomes a collection of ancient population lines that just happen to exist within the same modern borders. At that point, even the idea of asking what ethnicity is closest to Mexicans starts to feel off, because you're no longer dealing with one genetic reference point, since you're dealing with several, some of which don't even overlap within the country itself. And that leads to a much more uncomfortable realization. If this level of diversity exists inside indigenous Mexico, then the story of modern Mexican identity isn't just about mixing or colonization, as it's about how multiple ancient human histories collided, overlapped, and stayed visible right up to today. So if this diversity is so extreme and well documented, why does nobody talk about the life or death medical consequences when doctors treat Mexican patients? Why this matters when you're sick? There's a moment in medicine where lab reports stop being neutral because they start deciding outcomes. Which substance works, which dose is safe, and which treatment quietly fails without anyone noticing until it's too late. When researchers mapped Mexican genetic diversity, the conversation shifted from ancestry curiosity to something urgent. According to the 2014 Stanford-led study covered by the LA Times, this variation directly affects biomedical traits like disease risk and medication metabolism. Mexican DNA is diverse is a clinical warning label hiding in plain sight, since the problem starts when medicine assumes uniformity where none exists. The Gulf News report on the DNA study pointed out that oversimplifying genetic categories makes substance responses and guidelines unreliable for millions. This is actually wrong in ways that change clinical outcomes. The LA Times coverage explained that genetic variation influences how individuals process substance and how diseases develop. Two patients under the same broad ethnic category could respond completely differently to the same medication, simply because their underlying genetic structures are not the same. This gap becomes clearer with newer data. A 2023 Science article discussing Mexico's expanding genomic database described how researchers are building large-scale reference systems because older datasets borrowed from European or Asian populations don't translate cleanly to Mexican populations. Entire populations were being treated using reference data that didn't match their biology. Stanford Medicine's release noted that cosmopolitan Mexican populations carry genetic patterns tied to biomedical traits that weren't previously accounted for in clinical models. Furthermore, an eLife study found that these admixture patterns are not static, as they change over time with migration and population movement. When clinical trials use broad racial categories instead of population-specific data, they introduce critical errors into treatment decisions. This is why the Science database article highlighted the push for dedicated genetic reference panels built from the actual populations being treated. When dosage and disease risk are tied to genetic variation, generalized assumptions become dangerous medical blind spots. There is no single closest ethnicity to Mexicans. The real discovery isn't closeness, because it's complexity that refuses simplification. Does this change how you see Mexican identity? And what ancestry question should be explored next?